Athens chose not to defend its countryside. It chose to abandon it. Early in the Peloponnesian War, Athens deliberately allowed Attica to be burned, its farms destroyed, its villages emptied, while the population was pulled behind the long walls and the city staked everything on the sea. Not a retreat. Not a temporary sacrifice. A collective decision to erase the option of normal life. Why would a democracy willingly accept the loss of homes, land, and livelihood? Why would a political system built on citizen consent force its entire society into a corner with no exit? And what kind of strategy turns war from an event into a permanent condition of survival? This was not a plan designed to win quickly. It was a plan designed to make reversal impossible. Because once Athens chose the sea over the land, the war could no longer be paused, negotiated, or easily escaped. It could only continue until the system held or collapsed. To understand why this choice was made, we first have to understand the strategic trap Athens was already in. Athens did not enter the Peloponnesian War looking for a decisive battle. It entered the war facing a structural disadvantage it could not fix. On land, Athens could not match Sparta. Not in hoplite discipline. Not in allied land armies. Not in endurance across the Greek countryside. Any conventional strategy, meeting Sparta in open battle, defending farms village by village, protecting Attica as a traditional homeland, led to the same outcome: attrition. Athens would lose. This was the strategic problem at the heart of the war. Athens was strong, wealthy, innovative, yet trapped inside a model of warfare that favored its enemy. So the question was never how to defeat Sparta on land. The real question was far more dangerous. How do you redesign the war so that the terrain itself no longer matters? The answer Athens arrived at was radical. Instead of defending what made it vulnerable, it would abandon it. Instead of preserving normal life during war, it would deliberately destroy the possibility of normal life. By evacuating the countryside and shifting survival entirely to naval power and overseas supply, Athens transformed the conflict into something Sparta was not designed to fight. This was not an act of desperation. It was a calculated attempt to rewrite the rules of war, by forcing the entire society to cross a line it could never uncross. And once that line was crossed, every assumption about how wars are supposed to end stopped applying. To understand why Athens chose such an extreme path, we have to strip the war down to its actual geometry, not the slogans, not the later moral judgments, but the constraints that boxed decision-makers into a narrowing corridor. This was not a symmetrical conflict. It only looked that way on the surface. Athens and Sparta were not fighting the same war. Sparta was a land power. Its strength came from disciplined hoplites, social militarization, and a system built to sustain repetitive campaigning on Greek soil. Athens was something else entirely. A maritime empire disguised as a city-state. Its wealth flowed from tribute, trade routes, and overseas allies. Its military advantage was concentrated in triremes, crews, dockyards, and logistical reach across the Aegean. That difference mattered more than any single battle. On paper, Athens controlled the sea. In reality, it was geographically exposed. Attica was open, flat, and impossible to fortify in full. Its agricultural base sat directly in the path of Spartan invasion routes. Every year the same threat loomed: Spartan armies marching in, burning crops, provoking a response. Sparta did not need to conquer Athens. It only needed to force Athens to fight the wrong kind of war. And that was the trap. If Athens chose to defend the countryside, it would bleed itself dry in land engagements it could not win decisively. If it chased a climactic battle, it played to Spartan strengths. If it tried to protect every village, it diluted its power across terrain that favored the enemy. There was no version of a conventional defense that ended well. At the same time, Athens faced constraints of its own making. Its empire depended on uninterrupted maritime access. Grain shipments from the Black Sea were not optional, they were existential. Urban population density was already high, even before mass evacuation. Politically, Athens was a democracy under stress. Public opinion mattered. Factionalism mattered. Any prolonged hardship risked internal collapse long before military defeat. And time was not neutral. The longer the war lasted, the more pressure built inside the city. The more voices would demand a quick victory or an exit. Sparta understood this dynamic intuitively. Its strategy was simple: apply steady pressure, avoid catastrophic risk, wait for Athens to fracture under its own weight. Athens saw that too. Which meant the real contest was not about territory. It was about endurance. Who could force the other side to fight longer than its system could tolerate? And that realization led to a conclusion most states never accept. If Athens allowed the war to follow its natural rhythm, seasonal invasions, limited engagements, temporary truces, it would lose control of the timeline. So it chose to seize the timeline instead. By withdrawing behind the long walls and refusing to contest the land, Athens denied Sparta the kind of victory it understood how to achieve. No decisive battle. No surrendering army. No negotiation leverage tied to captured territory. In doing so, Athens made a silent but enormous bet. That its naval supremacy, imperial revenues, and logistical system could outlast Sparta's patience, and that its own society could survive the psychological cost of living indefinitely under siege conditions. It was a strategic inversion. Athens accepted visible destruction in exchange for invisible control. And inside that inversion, the traditional rules of war began to break down. If a conventional Greek general had been handed Athens' situation at the outbreak of the war, the advice would have been predictable and fatal. Defend the land. Meet the enemy when they invade. Protect farms, villages, and honor. Force a decision before morale collapses. This was not reckless thinking. It was doctrine. For centuries, Greek warfare was built around a simple logic: land defines the state, and battle decides the war. Citizen soldiers defended their own fields. Victory restored normal life. Defeat forced negotiation. From that perspective, Athens' choice looks irrational. Abandoning the countryside violated every assumption of hoplite warfare. Refusing battle looked like weakness. Allowing enemy devastation without response looked politically suicidal. Doctrine would have warned of three dangers. First, morale. A population that watches its homes burn without fighting is expected to lose faith in leadership. Second, legitimacy. A democracy that refuses to defend its land risks appearing detached, elitist, or cowardly. Third, deterrence. If destruction is tolerated once, the enemy will return again and again. By doctrinal standards, Athens was inviting long-term ruin. And yet, every correct alternative was worse. Had Athens fought on land, it would have faced an opponent optimized for exactly that environment. Spartan hoplites were not designed for brilliance, they were designed for reliability. Attrition favored them. Had Athens tried to protect every village, it would have stretched its forces thin, losing naval initiative while still failing to stop devastation. Had Athens pursued a decisive engagement, it would have risked everything on a single outcome, against an enemy whose entire system existed to win that kind of fight. Doctrine assumed symmetry. This war had none. Athens was not weaker across the board. It was weaker in the wrong domain. So doctrine did what doctrine always does in asymmetric conditions: it offered answers to a problem that no longer existed. Athens faced a strategic paradox. The more it behaved like a traditional Greek state, the more vulnerable it became. The more it rejected tradition, the more unstable its internal politics grew. There was no safe option, only choices with different failure modes. And that is where the strategy crossed a crucial threshold. Athens stopped asking, "How do we win this war?" It began asking, "How do we prevent ourselves from losing the wrong way?" The answer was not a better battle plan. It was a redefinition of what counted as survival. By refusing to fight on land, Athens accepted visible loss to avoid invisible defeat. It chose structural endurance over symbolic resistance. But that choice required something doctrine never teaches: a willingness to sacrifice short-term legitimacy for long-term system survival. And the ability to hold that line under relentless internal pressure. Which raises the next question: how does a decision this extreme even become politically possible? Decisions like this do not emerge fully formed. They surface slowly, under pressure, through elimination rather than inspiration. Athens did not wake up one morning and choose abandonment. It arrived there by discovering that every other path collapsed under scrutiny. Inside the Athenian leadership, the debate was not abstract. It was concrete, political, and deeply uncomfortable. Defend the land, and risk decisive defeat. Fight Sparta head-on, and gamble the entire city on one battle. Delay, and let the war's tempo slip into the enemy's hands. None of these options were neutral. Each carried a different kind of ruin. What made the final decision possible was not confidence. It was alignment. Strategic reality, political authority, and material capability briefly pointed in the same direction. Athens possessed one overwhelming advantage: naval dominance. Not tactical superiority, but systemic reach. Its fleet was not just a weapon. It was a transportation network, an economic artery, a psychological signal, and a coercive tool over its allies. This mattered because the core assumption behind the strategy was brutally simple. As long as Athens controlled the sea, it could eat, trade, move, and punish. As long as Sparta remained land-bound, it could only destroy what Athens had already chosen to lose. That assumption inverted the value of territory. Land became expendable. Mobility became decisive. Endurance replaced honor as the primary currency of war. But this assumption was fragile. It depended on uninterrupted logistics, on allied compliance, on naval crews staying loyal and paid, on the city tolerating overcrowding, fear, and resentment without tearing itself apart. Which is why the proposal faced resistance. Not because it was illogical, but because it was irreversible. Once the countryside was abandoned, it could not be partially defended later. Once the population was evacuated, returning them under fire would signal panic. Once the war became a siege condition, Athens would be trapped inside its own choice. Supporters of the strategy understood this clearly. That was the point. By removing the option to retreat back into traditional warfare, Athens would force itself to stay disciplined. No emotional counterattacks. No reactive battles to satisfy public anger. No symbolic gestures that weakened the system. This was strategic self-binding. The leadership was not betting on brilliance. It was betting on control. Control of tempo. Control of escalation. Control of where the war could and could not be fought. And control of internal behavior. The most dangerous enemy was not Sparta. It was Athens itself, angry, frightened, and capable of sabotaging its own strategy under pressure. So the decision that emerged was not heroic. It was coercive. A plan designed to limit choice, not expand it. To force rational behavior by eliminating emotional alternatives. But every system built on constraint contains a silent risk. If the assumptions hold, the system stabilizes. If they crack, collapse is not gradual, it is immediate. And that brings us to the most dangerous phase of this strategy, turning theory into lived reality. On paper, the strategy looked austere but coherent. In reality, it was a system balanced on pressure points that could fail without warning. Execution began with a movement that was military in scale but civilian in nature. The countryside emptied. Farmers, families, livestock, tools, everything that could move was pulled toward the city. Athens compressed itself into stone, walls, and harbor infrastructure. This was not a temporary refuge. It was a forced reconfiguration of daily life. The long walls became more than fortifications. They became arteries, linking the city to the port, and the port to the sea. As long as those arteries stayed open, Athens lived. But every layer of that system carried its own failure mode. First, logistics. Grain supply became the single most critical variable. Athens could no longer rely on Attica to feed its population. Every ship arriving late, every disrupted convoy, every hostile maneuver at sea amplified anxiety inside the walls. This was not famine yet, but the shadow of famine was constant. The fleet had to operate continuously. Not for glory. For calories. Crews needed pay. Allies needed compliance. Ports needed to remain accessible. A naval defeat was no longer a military setback. It was an existential threat. Second, social compression. Tens of thousands of people living in proximity created friction no strategy document could fully anticipate. Crowding strained sanitation. Disease spread faster. Personal loss became collective grievance. Every burned farm outside the walls became a political argument inside them. Athens was fighting two wars simultaneously. One against Sparta's pressure. Another against internal exhaustion. Third, discipline. The entire strategy depended on restraint. Athens had to not respond to provocation, not launch punitive land raids, not chase symbolic victories. Every impulse to do something risked unraveling the logic of endurance. That restraint was hardest to maintain when suffering was visible. Leadership could explain strategy. It could not erase anger. And anger searches for outlets. Fourth, allied dependency. Athens' empire was not built on affection. It was built on tribute, naval enforcement, and perceived inevitability. As long as Athens looked stable, allies complied. If Athens looked trapped or desperate, the system began to wobble. Any rebellion forced a choice: suppress it or signal weakness. Suppression required ships. Ships pulled away from supply routes. This was the paradox of control. The more Athens needed to demonstrate power, the more it risked overextension. And then there were the uncontrollable variables. Weather. Accidents. Human error. A single storm could delay grain fleets. A single misjudged engagement could cost ships Athens could not afford to lose. This strategy had no buffer. There was no fallback position. No reserve farmland. No secondary mode of survival. Everything ran through the same narrow channel. Which meant the most dangerous moments were not major battles. They were near misses. A convoy arriving just in time. A crisis contained at the last moment. A decision not taken. Each survival reinforced confidence. Each reinforcement encouraged further commitment. And that is how extreme strategies often tighten their grip. Success does not reduce risk. It normalizes it. By the time Athens fully understood how fragile the system was, it was already living inside it. And while Athens focused on holding this structure together, the other side was watching, trying to understand what kind of war it was actually being pulled into. From Sparta's perspective, Athens' behavior was baffling, but not immediately alarming. The countryside lay open. Fields burned. Villages emptied. By every traditional measure, this looked like success. Sparta had entered Attica and inflicted visible damage without resistance. No pitched battle. No desperate counterattack. No collapse behind the walls. The Spartan command interpreted this through familiar lenses. Athens, they assumed, was avoiding battle because it feared defeat. Avoidance signaled weakness. Weakness would eventually force engagement. This assumption was not irrational. It was doctrinal. In the Spartan model of war, pressure produces response. Destruction provokes defense. Time favors the side that can endure repetition. What Sparta did not fully register was that Athens was not trying to stop the pressure. It was trying to absorb it. Each invasion of Attica was not a step closer to decision, it was a ritualized action that changed nothing essential. Sparta could devastate land Athens had already written off. The signal Sparta believed it was sending, "You are being hurt," was not the signal Athens was receiving. Athens read the invasions as confirmation that the enemy was stuck inside a narrow playbook. This misalignment mattered. Sparta continued to apply pressure where it expected pressure to work. Athens continued to refuse the kind of response Sparta needed in order to escalate. At sea, the situation was different, but less intuitive. Sparta was not blind to naval weakness. It simply did not build its strategy around correcting it quickly. Spartan leadership treated the maritime domain as secondary, important, but not decisive. The core belief remained that Athens would eventually be forced out of its walls. This belief delayed adaptation. Instead of fully committing to disrupting supply routes, pressuring ports, or systematically targeting the naval system, Sparta relied on repetition and patience. Year after year. Campaign after campaign. The expectation was cumulative exhaustion. But Athens had redefined what exhaustion meant. It was no longer about land loss or symbolic humiliation. It was about whether ships kept moving and food kept arriving. As long as those conditions held, Athens could endure damage that would have broken any conventional polis. Sparta also underestimated the political consequences of Athens' restraint. By refusing battle, Athens denied Sparta the psychological payoff of victory. There were no captured generals. No defeated armies. No moment to leverage into negotiations. This created a strategic vacuum. Sparta was winning the wrong metrics. The more this dragged on, the more pressure built, not inside Athens alone, but inside the Spartan alliance. Allies expected results. They wanted closure. They wanted Athens to fall. Instead, they saw a city still standing, still trading, still projecting naval power. That disconnect mattered. Yet Sparta's misreading was not total. There were moments when the system flickered, when Athens' dependence on the sea became visible. Moments when the war briefly approached the pressure point Athens feared most. But those moments were treated as opportunities, not as necessities. Sparta reacted. It did not reorganize. And that distinction defines the middle phase of the war. Athens was fighting to preserve a system. Sparta was fighting to force an outcome. One side measured success by continuity. The other by disruption. As long as those logics remained misaligned, Athens could survive. But survival was not the same as victory. And as the war stretched on, the cost of living inside an irreversible strategy began to accumulate, quietly, relentlessly, and unevenly. Which brings us to the final reckoning. What did this strategy actually produce, and what did it ultimately cost? Measured narrowly, the strategy worked, at first. Athens did not collapse under the initial shock. It did not break when its countryside burned. It did not rush into the land battle Sparta wanted. The city survived. Its fleet remained operational. Its supply lines, strained but intact. Its political system, volatile but functional. By the logic Athens had chosen, this counted as success. But survival inside an irreversible strategy is not free. The costs did not arrive all at once. They accumulated, layer by layer. First, the human cost. Displacement was not an episode. It became a condition. Families lived for years without homes they recognized as theirs. Loss turned from shock into background noise. Grief stopped being exceptional and started being routine. Crowding intensified disease, fear, and resentment. Every death inside the walls felt pointless, because it was disconnected from visible battlefield victories. War without visible progress corrodes patience faster than defeat. Second, the logistical cost. Athens had designed a system with no margin for error. That system held, until it didn't. Every disruption in supply forced emergency decisions. Every naval loss carried disproportionate weight. What once looked like control began to look like dependence. The fleet was no longer a weapon among others. It was the single point of failure. Third, the political cost. A strategy built on restraint requires long-term trust. Trust eroded. As years passed, the original architects of the strategy lost influence. New leaders inherited a system they did not design, but could not escape. Each internal shift weakened coherence. Debates became sharper. Policy became reactive. The logic that had once justified patience now justified escalation. If everything had already been sacrificed, why not risk more? This was the most dangerous transformation. The original strategy aimed to prevent reckless action by removing emotional alternatives. Over time, the same absence of alternatives encouraged overreach. Athens stopped asking whether actions preserved the system. It began asking whether actions might finally end the war. That was a different question, and a fatal one. Fourth, the psychological cost for decision-makers. The leaders who initiated the strategy accepted that they would be hated before they were vindicated, if vindication ever came. But as hardship dragged on, blame became detached from logic. The distinction between strategic necessity and political cruelty blurred. Leadership became a liability rather than a stabilizer. Once that happened, the strategy lost its anchor. And this exposes the central fragility of self-binding strategies. They work only as long as the people who understand them remain in control. When those people are removed, the constraints remain, but the discipline disappears. Athens did not fail because the strategy was irrational. It failed because the strategy demanded more consistency, more restraint, and more internal cohesion than a democratic system under prolonged stress could sustain. If it had failed earlier, it would have failed cleanly. Because it endured, it failed slowly and expensively. Which forces a final question: what was this strategy really about, and what does it teach us beyond Athens? At a distance, Athens' decision is often described as defensive, cautious, even passive. That description misses the point. This was not a strategy about avoiding battle. It was a strategy about controlling choice. Athens understood something uncomfortable. Wars are not lost only by military defeat. They are lost when a system is forced to make decisions it cannot survive. So Athens tried to remove those decisions from the table. By abandoning the countryside, it eliminated the temptation to fight on land. By concentrating behind the long walls, it eliminated the illusion of partial commitment. By tying survival to the sea, it reduced the war to a single strategic axis it believed it could manage. This was not brilliance in tactics. It was discipline in constraint. The strategy broke three core assumptions embedded in classical military thinking. First, that territory defined survival. Athens demonstrated, temporarily, that mobility, logistics, and connectivity could replace land as the foundation of power. Second, that morale depends on visible resistance. Athens wagered that morale could instead be sustained by continuity, by the simple fact that life, trade, and governance continued despite destruction. Third, that escalation is always a response to pressure. Athens attempted the opposite, absorbing pressure to deny the enemy strategic leverage. In modern terms, this was not a battle plan. It was systems engineering under fire. But the strategy also revealed a hard limit. Self-binding strategies demand exceptional stability. They require leadership continuity. They require public trust over time horizons longer than political cycles. They require a society willing to endure pain without demanding immediate payoff. Athens had none of those in sufficient supply. The deeper lesson is not that the strategy was wrong. It is that the strategy asked a democratic society to behave like a closed system, disciplined, patient, and resistant to internal disruption, while remaining open, participatory, and emotionally volatile. That contradiction did not explode. It eroded. What Athens attempted was to turn war into an environment rather than an event. To normalize danger. To routinize loss. To make endurance the metric of success. This works only if endurance itself does not become the source of collapse. And that is the final, uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous strategies are not the ones that fail quickly. They are the ones that succeed just long enough to lock a system into commitments it can no longer sustain. Athens did not misunderstand war. It misunderstood itself. And that is why this strategy remains unsettling, not because it was reckless, but because it almost worked. Athens chose to survive by removing the option to retreat into normal life. It forced an entire society to live inside a war it could not pause. That decision was coherent. It was rational. And it was brutally demanding. The failure did not come from ignorance or cowardice. It came from a mismatch between strategic design and social capacity. Athens built a system that required unbroken discipline, and entrusted it to a political structure defined by debate, turnover, and pressure. The lesson is not historical trivia. It is a warning. Any strategy that depends on irreversible commitment must ask one question first. Not whether it can defeat the enemy, but whether the system executing it can survive its own success. Because once the bridge is burned, the fire behind you matters less than the ground you are standing on.